Now that we've had a brief look at just cause in our 7 rules for jus ad bellum, justice for war, let's carry on. So the second one is proportionality, and then as you can see, there's the remainder of reasonable chance of success, legitimate authority, right of intention, last resort, and public declaration of war. Proportionality. Let's suppose, for the sake of discussion, that one country attacks another, or a nation attacks another. Like S, call one S, one P. So S attacks P. That you would think, of some kind of attack is justified, but proportionality plays an important role in whether or not you can go to war. This is sort of a wide proportionality. And this involves, a sense of self-defense as well. So if S attacks P with the intention of inflicting a harm level, whatever that happens to be, just call it X, harm level of X, then we would say, so S attacks to cause a harm level of X, P, we would say, has the right of self-defense, right? And of course, when you defend yourself, remember the example in the previous video, the guy smashing the window, sticking his arm in, he's going to cause you some harm by trying to steal your wallet. So we could call that economic harm. What kind of harm can you do in self-defense? And I said, it was not very acceptable. Here we can use the word proportionate. It's not very proportionate if you, the guy tries to steal something and then, you set off a bomb or you kill the person or whatever. Whereas you could have just scared them off or maybe grabbed his arm or something like that. So if S is causing P a harm through the attack and P has a right to retaliate, what's the level of harm that P can do? So, and also you're comparing harm. You're trying to compare harms, because if the guy's trying to steal my wallet, I'm not going to cause a harm in my defense by trying to steal his wallet. So I'm not going to do the exact same thing. So what you've got in the notion of proportionality, of whether or not it's met, is whether or not you can measure different harms. Like as the politicians would say, excuse me, what is a measured response? But how do you have a measured response when you maybe you don't have a common measure? Like one group inflicts an economic penalty, and then the response, or a punishment through their attack, and then the response, the defense, maybe they kill some of the attackers. So maybe in the attack nobody was killed, but economic damage was inflicted. But in the defense, people were killed. How do you weigh the economic with the retaliation or the defense of killing? Is that really a proportion that you can justify? So in order to repel this attack, we'd have to kill, but the harm inflicted by the attack was only an economic one. So there has to be some sort of proportionality measure, right? So this is why it's a just cause to retaliate when someone tries to break into your house, but you don't get to just do anything you want in response. It has to be a measured response. So that's where proportionality, so whether you can go to war, there has to be some sense of proportionality involved in the discussion. But of course, there are, as we say in the philosophy business, there's epistemological problems here, because you're trying to compare things that might be incommensurable. That is, they don't have a common measure, and proportionality, the very concept of it, when you're trying to determine whether things are proportionate, is there's a common measure, right? Heights or whatever. If I want to compare my height with another person's height, the common measure is that we can both be measured by, let's say, a centimeter as a unit. But when you're talking about economic harms and hurting, like physically hurting people, what's the common measure there? How do you say that they're in any ways comparable? So that's an epistemological issue in the comparing incommensurables. Nonetheless, that's part of whether or not it's legitimate to go to war, if you could have some kind of measured response. Also, other thing, so not only is there a just cause, and you have to proportionality questions. In going to war, there has to be some reasonable chance of success, right? That's been an important one. It's a little bit. If S attacks P and P has no chance of winning, should P go to war? Or is it a little bit of the, he who runs away lives to fight another day? In that sense, a reasonable chance to success, you don't get into a war until it's not justified to go to war and basically, well, think about it. You wouldn't be happy if a government went to war and they said, yeah, we got no chance of winning. We shouldn't get involved then, right? You should look for an alternative, even if you have a just cause or whatever. You shouldn't enter into the war. So there has to be some chance of winning it. Otherwise, it's almost akin to a kind of suicide, right? You have no chance of winning the war. It should be something to be avoided in that sense. And of course, it's the old thing. Generals don't send troops on suicide missions. All right, let's carry on here. The fourth one is, again, another, shall we say, another political aspect. It's legitimate authority. This is an old one, that war is the game of princes and kings. And so not just anybody can declare war, not just any group can declare war. It has to be a legitimate authority. And that, of course, now raises problems with issues involving terrorism and things like that, because if there's a clash between a government and another kind of organization that's maybe not, shall we say, a political organization, can there be any legitimate authority on both sides to declare a war? How is this going to work? So these traditional 7 rules have run into problems in modern discussions of warfare. In any case, though, traditionally there has to be some kind of legitimate authority. Now, again, I keep prefacing these as traditionally, not everybody agrees with this. These are the general rules that have come out of the long tradition that we call the just war tradition, again, beginning all the way back in people like Cicero and the ancient Greeks. So in the tradition, it was usually the head of state that was your legitimate authority. And think about legitimate authority, as a kind of sober second thought. Many things in life are justified. You could do it. You might have some success. But the authority, kind of legitimate authority, is like a sort of a bit of check on whether or not you're being a little bit hasty or rash. So that's a legitimate authority might be the one who comes in and says, well, all things considered, this is not a good idea, even if there is a just cause or whatnot. So and many people say that if you remove a legitimate authority, you're going to open up all kinds of things like, possibility of justifying holy wars and et cetera, et cetera. So it's another attempt, and in the spirit, remember, the spirit of just war thinking is to try to put all kinds of constraints on war, to make it really tough to justify a war. Right? So that's part of the process too. So the legitimate authority functions kind of like the concept of a bicameral legislature, where you have a sober second thought in a Senate. Whether it always works is another question, but in principle, that's the idea of a Senate, and that's the idea of the legitimate authority. Now, this one, right intention, has been the subject of a lot of controversy. Probably, people argue about this, but it's probably the notion of right intention comes largely out of certain thoughts in Aquinas. Other thinkers have regarded it as, in the just war tradition, as nonsense, like Brodius, who was a great thinker in the just war tradition, thought that right intention was ridiculous. But the whole idea of right intention was to prevent this from becoming a rationalization. Like, yeah, we want to go attack that country because of their oil fields. And then we look to justify all of these. We put the oil fields off to the side, and we can do this kind of analysis. And this one, well, clearly is going to be blocked because you're not entering even into the process with the right motivations, the right intention. So this one is sometimes regarded as a kind of deontological constraint, right? These ones tend to be more consequentialist types of thinking, but the right intention is, in some senses, I wouldn't call it a Kantian constraint because you don't want to start attributing intentionality to Kant. That's not the idea. But it's more of a flavor of a deontological constraint in that it's not looking directly at consequences, but it is looking at a motivational aspect or an orientational aspect to why you might go to war. So you have to go to war with the right intention. And again, not everybody agrees with this one, but it's still part of the tradition. All right. Last resort. Well, there's not a lot to say about that one, although that's come up as one of a bit of a problematic one to interpret. Like, how do you know when you're at a last resort? So, like proportionality, how do you measure harms that perhaps are incommensurable? How do you know for sure that you're hit the last resort? Like, you talk to the government of the other side and talks broke down. Well, is it because maybe the other side's team or your team, you were lousy negotiators? Maybe you need some better negotiators. Maybe someone got off to a bad personal relationship and that infected the whole process and it went sideways. How do you know for sure that if you didn't just wait a little while and let things calm down, cooler heads would prevail? So last resort sounds very easy in principle. Like, yeah, make sure you exhaust all possible avenues. But the epistemological problem just rears its head. How can you be sure? How would you measure your level of confidence? If you don't know from, shall we say, like an omniscient perspective, like a God's eye view, what all the possibilities are, how would you know for sure that you've exhausted them, right? It's that old problem of there will be things that you simply don't know about. How can you know if you satisfy them or if there's other possibilities? But in principle, this serves, we can say, kind of as a guiding ideal, that do your best, that someone in your position could reasonably make the argument that we have tried everything that we can think of and before we go to war. So at least you're not accused of pardon the pun, jumping the gun in this sense. So last resort. But again, there's been a lot of discussion. As a matter of fact, there's been discussion in the just war literature, in the military ethics journals for quite some time about all of them. And I'm just scratching the surface on them. So right intention, last resort, and then of course the public declaration. This is really linked up with legitimate authority. This again is the attempt to embed war in a more legal kind of context. So if you think kind of there's sort of a lot of law and judicial jurisprudence stuff going on here, you're right. That's essentially where it comes from. It's really all about trying to put all kinds of constraints on war to build it up, where it's not just you got a good cause, head to war. No, there's all these kind of subclauses. You got to make sure all these conditions are satisfied. And yes, it is a public declaration. Cicero, whom I mentioned previously, talked about this elaborate process before the Roman state would declare a war. So they would go and sometimes they'd have to go and send an emissary and give 30 days warning. Then they'd have to go talk to the Vestal Virgins in Rome and make sure they're okay with it. And so there was all kinds of pomp and ceremony that was involved. And then it was all very public, right? So that war is coming, that Rome would try and make sure that its adversary would know about this, so that it's like, hey, we warned you, we didn't want to go to war, but we think we've exhausted all this. And so then there's a public declaration to distinguish it from something like, a cowardly ambush. And only proper authorities, right? It's linked. Only proper authorities can make this public declaration. So not just anybody is a legitimate authority, and so not just anybody can say, yes, it's war. No, it doesn't work that way. It has to be through a proper authority. But of course, you can argue about this. What does it really mean to have a public declaration? What exactly is a legitimate authority according to, because we all know that, various nation states, they set things up so that they're the legitimate authority, but we may, on the outside, not recognize it, and so that creates all kinds of other kinds of problems. So in that sense, You've got a number of these. They're not perfect. They're all open to interpretation. But again, the whole thinking about just war is putting constraints. And so there's your constraints for, shall we say, the left-hand side of the dichotomy. There's 7 of them traditionally. Some of them fall out of favor. I think trends are, this used to be pretty well the biggest one. These started to grow out of it as it became, certainly these have been around for a long time. But trends are now that we're leaning more, this one is getting front end, more and more loaded, shall we say. In the literature, people are going back more to a just cause framework. And these are starting to take on less of an importance, but trends change, and we'll see where this goes. But so that covers that. Stay tuned, and we'll look at the next side, which is the jus in bello.